It's a comic book debate that's as old as time. Which version of a character is better? Is it the classic, the OG, the original version of Spider-Man versus the current year Marvel version of Spider-Man? There are pluses and minuses. We're going to talk about both. Now, this is not just about Spider-Man. This talk is really going to apply to every version of every character that's classic versus modern. Batman versus Superman versus Wonder Woman and everybody in between. The answer I'm going to give you applies just the same. And surprisingly, the answer is they're both just as good, but there is something that's very, very broken in modern Western periodical comics. And we're going to talk about it in 3, 2, 1. Before we figure out what's broken, let's figure out why each camp, classic versus modern, loves the character the way they love the character. So if I were to walk into a comic shop and I pulled some old geezer and coot aside, and maybe that even applies to me, I'm old enough for it, and asked him, why do you love the classic version of the character so much? What is it about the original, say, Ditko version of Spider-Man that makes you keep hanging on? And you're probably going to get a mix of answers. You're going to get something like, for example, that era where that comic was created, if it was the 40s or the 50s or the 60s, is a simpler time. It harkens back to this wholesome era of people just being heroic, action, adventure, things that are very... You could almost call it simple in nature. That's not to say there's anything wrong with simple, but it harkens back to just a time where you knew what was what and who was who, and there was less complexity, less complication in the world. Plus, those stories, even though technically speaking they were written, I guess, quote unquote, for kids, there was enough of a simpleness that you could get into it even if you were an adult. It applied all the way across the range, and if you liked it, you liked it. And that's great. That's where the genesis of the fan base came from. Here's another example. If you were reading those comics from the early days of the 20th century, you'd notice that those comics, a lot of the storytelling tropes, a lot of the storytelling structure was based upon classic archetypes from literature and mythology. I mean, if you look at the Justice League is basically a stand-in for the Greek gods. Superman is Zeus, Batman as Hades, Flash as Hermes, and on and on and on. So it was a way to kind of almost read classic literature, but read it in a fun, modern, reimagined context. Then if you were thinking about those classic examples and how the comics from the early 20th century borrowed from classic literature and tropes, you also understood that a lot of the times the comics were meant to be repeatable, reproducible, and almost disposable. And I don't mean that in a bad way. You could just go into the newsstand, pick up a 5-cent comic or a 10-cent comic, depending on which decade you're talking about, pick it up, read it, enjoy it. It was fun. It was a quick time to get away, to imagine new worlds, to imagine new realities. And then when you're done with it, you put it in your back pocket and rode off on your bike to the baseball field, or you kept it in your room and reread it over and over again, or if you were done with it, you just chucked it. It was meant to be mass appeal, mass entertainment for the masses. You didn't have a lot of emphasis from the creators to just create deep, thought-provoking commentary or talk about social realities and how they applied to this fictional world. It was cheap, quick, fun entertainment you could rely on or count on month after month after month, or week after week, depending on which publisher you were dealing with. But the idea was the creators were creating cheap, fun, almost disposable entertainment, but disposable in the sense that you could just get through it quick, enjoy it, love it, and then move on. It wasn't meant to be lauded as a work of art. It wasn't meant to be cherished or held in some sort of reverence. It was meant to get in, entertain as many people as quickly as possible, and then get out. And then lastly, if you pull those things together using classic archetypes and a focus on fun and entertainment, you notice that created we'll call it the evolution engine or the inspiration engine for decades and generations of creators to come. A lot of the creators that came in the mid to late part of the 20th century were inspired by those early works. Why? Because it took classic archetypes, a focus on fun, put it together in a colorful package, and then say, oh, I want to do more of that. And I want to do more of it and do it in different ways. That eventually inspired the boom of the 80s. That eventually inspired the creation of Image Comics in the 90s, and so on and so on. In other words, that combination of classic archetypes, a focus on fun, colorful, bright, reimagined ideas, that is a source and a seed for inspiration. And it powered the comics industry for decades upon decades. So if you ask somebody why they love classic comics, there are 4 ideas right there that really are a strong indicator of why classic is best. But classic is not best. It sort of depends. Let's talk about what goes on with the folks who love the modern comics. Out with the old and in with the new. That is also a tale as old as time. So you have the modern reader, the so-called mythical modern reader. Now, why do they call it mythical? Because honestly, the audience is just not as big as it used to be. That's not necessarily wrong. That's not to say that the audience doesn't count or that the audience doesn't exist. It's just not as big. But they are there. They do continue to buy comics, and let's talk about a few reasons why they like modern comics, the way comics are today versus the way they were way back when. Probably the top of the list is relatability. Modern readers, some of them, however many they are, they like the idea that modern comics take place in a modern context. We're not going to have Batman do his detective work on landlines and punch cards. I mean, you got to update things to keep pace with the times, both in technology and infrastructure. There's nothing wrong with that, and you also have to apply the same thing to cars, the way the communication works, the internet, and everything in between. Next up on the list is you have an update on what we'll call attitudes and sensibilities that go along with modern life. The way men and women interacted, say in the 1940s, is very different than it is today, by a long shot. Some of the classic hero interactions with each other and their supporting cast were, to be honest, pretty dated, pretty cringy. Nobody wants that to continue in that way. They want their relationships to evolve. They want the way they interact with each other to evolve. And the way we just talk about and look at things is very different today than it was, say, 40, 50 years ago. So there has to be a change. And it's better that we change and adapt to match with the modern audience, how they see the world. Now, this next point rubs some people the wrong way, mostly because of the way it was implemented, but it's not a invalid point. It's fair to say that social consciousness is at an all-time high in our society. So modern comics are much less shy about presenting those things like racism and sexism and corruption and police brutality and all the different things that sometimes get overplayed. Is that appropriate for every comic? No, I'm not saying it's appropriate for every comic, but publishers are freer and more varied in the number of titles and the different themes that they present in their stories. You're going to have a broader catalog of things that appeal to a broader catalog of people. There's something for everyone. And that's, I think, and overall a good thing, because you want more people reading comics. You want to have more types of stories that will appeal and apply to them. And probably the last point that makes sense for the modern audience is the comics, as we saw with the classic piece, they were individual comics, but they had layers so that they could apply to adults and to kids. But that definitely presented limitations. You couldn't have a comic that applies to adults and kids and then talk about heavy themes. You couldn't have more extreme visual presentations. For example, I can pick up a comic today for Dead Sky Publishing. They do splatter gore in a Western context. All right, well, I can't give that to a kid. An adult might like it, and an adult with very specific tastes might like that, but I can't give that to a kid. So you can now make comics that are strictly for adults, and that's a good thing. Or you can make comics that are specifically geared towards little kids. That is also a good thing. You want variety. So the classic comics really didn't have as much variety because, honestly, there weren't as many publishers, and you couldn't afford to just print out all different kinds of things in niche markets addressed for niche readers. Today, modern comics, you can do that, and you can be very specific and tailored towards individual tastes. So which one is better, classic or modern? The answer is neither, and both. You need both. Different people like different things. It's impossible to say one person likes one thing and the other person likes another thing, and that one is wrong and the other one is right. That's not how commerce works. That's not how capitalism works. If we're talking about selling comics. In a healthy comics industry, which unfortunately our current comics industry is not, there's got to be room for every preference and want. It's not to say you take away from one to give to the other. It's to say that you allow yourself to be big enough that you accommodate as many as you can within the confines of cost and expense and everything else. Readers who want classic characters can still get their classic characters through reading the back issues, reading it on digital scans, and just going through and reliving those memories as much as they want to. Modern readers have more than enough current year type of Marvel storytelling, and this applies to DC as well, that they can get their hands on. There's a ton of comics out there, I think more now at this point than in any previous decade that I can recollect. So if the modern readers are getting what they want and the classic readers are getting what they want, why is the Western periodical comic market shrinking? It's an easy answer, but it's not a simple answer. What they're missing, what they're lacking, the piece that's really, really broken is the bridge that connects the two. The journey that brings that classic version of the character, whether it's Spider-Man or Batman or whoever you can think of, into a modern context without losing the heart of what made that character special. What made that character develop a fan base. We'll call it a bridge, but you can name it whatever you want. But it's that transition journey from the old to the new. When you're talking about the fan base, which is the readers, the goal is never to replace. If you ever hear any editor or executive at any one of the companies, whether it's Marvel, DC, or anybody else, saying, we need a new audience, we need to get rid of our old audience, they are wrong. That person is wrong. The goal is never to replace one audience with the other. The goal is always to augment and expand your audience together in a new and greater fan base. So you don't want to replace classic with modern. You want classic to be happy and then make modern happy and have them grow together in one cohesive unit. The goal is never to replace. It's always to expand. The bridge, what I'll call it, is a conscious decision to hold on to the core of a character and the elements of a comic that made enough people happy to create that fan base in the first place, while updating the outmoded and outdated elements to appeal to a modern audience. You should be able to see echoes of what that made that character or that comic series great, regardless of the time frame you pick it up. It should look and feel like a natural evolution, bridging the transition from the classic reader to the modern reader. Again, the goal is never to replace the old readers with the new ones. The goal is to keep the old ones, but make new stuff that makes the new ones happy so that they grow together. Expand, not replace. I'm going to underscore the point by pointing out a few examples here. 4 in particular. Most of these, honestly, for me personally, are just heartbreaking. They can be fixed. They can be corrected. Some of them, maybe not so much, but let's go over it one by one. First example, and this one hurts me right in the gut. Iceman. Poor Bobby Drake. We didn't know how good we had it until Brian Michael Bendis showed up and made a damn mess of things. So what am I talking about? Of course, we're talking about all new X-Men number 40, released in 2014, written by Brian Michael Bendis. And that issue, and if you're watching the video, there's a screen cap there. If you've read the comic, you already know what I'm talking about. If you're reading the newsletter, you already know. A future, younger, alternate version of Jean Grey pulls Bobby Drake aside, and he says, What do you want to talk to me about? And she says, Bobby, duh, you're gay. And he didn't even know it. He didn't realize it, and all of a sudden, yeah, now he's gay. And not just gay, within the years that followed, he became ridiculously, flamboyantly gay. And it basically makes him the centerpiece of every Pride issue. Every time a storyline comes up with Iceman, that is basically his now persona. He has no personality other than he has to be flamboyantly gay, contrary to the decades of history that came before it. Let me be 100% crystal clear about this. There's nothing wrong with having a gay character in comics, Marvel, DC, or otherwise. The way this was done, though, was so mind-bogglingly tone-deaf and awful and just offensive and ridiculous. It's stunning to me. And now you say, well, what does that apply here? Well, the modern audience says, well, yeah, pride, representation, great. We've got another win, another person on our side, whatever that means. And the classic reader is going to say, wait, what happened to my Iceman? Bobby Drake was kind of a womanizer. Where did he go? Yeah, that character is no longer. So basically, he's almost a completely different person, but not in his power set, but in his personality and the way he addresses people around him. Everything about him is different. And to that I say, thank you, Bendis, you jerk. That was awful. Let's move over to DC because they are absolutely not immune. And unfortunately, you're going to see some parallels here. Superboy, a.k.a. John Kent, or maybe it's Superman, Man of Tomorrow version of John Kent. I'm not sure what you would even call it. Let's just say it's pretty clear the innocence of youth is not safe in the hands of Brian Michael Bendis. When Bendis came over to DC and he took over the Superman line, he created this storyline, if you're familiar, you already know this, where Ultraman comes into Earth, he kidnaps young John Kent, he's just a boy, he's just a kid, takes him over to Earth, an alternate Earth, and then when he comes back, he's aged up 7 years and very socially conscious, and again, also gay, and he's never recovered. He's just never recovered. Adult John Kent has failed to find his place, and this all started in Superman number 9, which is in 2014, also written by Brian Michael Bendis. And his aggressively tone-deaf personality and sexuality and everything around him just switched. And then when Tom Taylor took over, actually Tom Taylor was the one who was kind of really officially responsible for bringing him out of the closet. He never recovered. Right now he's just a side character, and DC doesn't know what to do with him. Again, it's kind of weird to call it classic, but you had an original character, which is young John Kent, who was just a boy, and they transitioned him into an adult that's a completely different personality and all kinds of problems. And what's missing? The bridge that broke, which is that lost 7 years on Earth 3 where Ultraman had him captive. He's just never recovered, and it's a mess, and now the character is pretty much unusable. This next one hurts me a bit. I gotta be honest with you. I was a Batman the Animated Series fan when it first released. I was there, I was watching, I was waiting, and I loved Harley Quinn. I thought she was a great character. She was created in the cartoon series. She wasn't a character that was created in the comics, but she was a hit. And then she developed and blossomed and bloomed a little bit. Why? Because she's a nuanced character. She suffers from trauma, being the Joker's girlfriend. She has layers of complex emotional conflict and all kinds of things going on. They brought her into the comics and would say, you know what, she deserves to be in print, and we're going to make her part of the greater DC canon, which is fantastic. And then what happened? 2007, the New 52, Jimmy Palmiotti and Amanda Conner, the husband and wife comic creative duo, got their hands on her, and she went from a nuanced, tragic figure to this silly Billy bimbo pretty much almost overnight. She's engaging in roller derby stuff. She talks like she's a cartoon character, but not in the Batman the Animated Series way, more like in the Looney Tunes way. All of that grief and hurt and complexity just went right out the window in favor of a wacky chick who is just kind of like a Mad Hatter archetype sort of thing. And lately she's also gone through her own, sexuality flip, where she basically spends almost all her time being Poison Ivy's girlfriend. I mean, that's what she's been reduced to. Are you seeing a pattern here? I'm not sure what it is between Marvel and DC, but yeah, there's something about taking character, breaking the character, and then not knowing what to do with what they broke, and then they do some kind of sexuality flip to kind of maybe fix it. I don't know. I'm not, again, this has nothing to do with whatever sexual preferences you have, but it seems to be a pattern of we just do this to fix a character that we broke because we don't want to unbreak what we broke. Okay, fine. Let's talk about one more example. Last but not least, let's take a look at probably the biggest and maybe even, depending on your point of view, the worst example. Now, fortunately, there is no sexuality change here. Thank God for that. But this one is a game changer in the sense that it affects a flagship character at the biggest publisher, at least in the West anyway, and it's Spider-Man. This one hurts. Spidey was it. Right? He was the model. I mean, we're talking about bridges that bring the classic character into a modern context and evolve the character, but kept the heart intact. He was it. He was the model for how to evolve and bring them forth, and maintaining that bridge between what was classic and what was modern, and bring those two together so that you could still see the core of what made him special. He was out of school, he was married, and he was on his way to creating this loyal family. And then what happened? Boy, J. Michael Straczynski and Joe Quesada began the infamous One More Day arc in Amazing Spider-Man number 544, which came out in 1999. And as we know, if you're familiar, the arc involves Spidey making a deal with Marvel's version of the Devil, who is Mephisto, that put an end to all his growth, retconned his marriage, and set him back decades in the service of saving his Aunt May. Now, that's a noble cause, sure, but at the same time, it just basically undid all his evolution and progress. ASM is Marvel's flagship title, but readers today, years, not even years, decades later, are still asking for One More Day to be undone, because the character and the title have yet to recover from that damage. There are still arguments that are happening right now over One More Day, because he was the model for growth, and Marvel basically tossed it out the window. So you're probably saying to yourself, okay, smart guy, what's the solution? How do we fix this? Can we fix it? The answer is sort of, depends on the situation. You got to take it case by case. Before we talk about how to fix it, let's talk about prevention, because an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. How do we prevent this? It begins with respect and research. When a creator rolls onto a title or is given a character, the assignment is a form of caretaking. We have to get that mentality and that attitude in place, and very, very much a cultural core of how Marvel and DC operates. They have to look at it as caretaking. It's not a gig. It's not just a writing thing to kind of get you to the next thing. It's caretaking. You are given a baby, a child, if you will, and you need to keep it safe and keep it secure with the same level of reverence that you would with anybody else's child. Regardless of the pitch, regardless of your genius idea of how you're going to tell their story, you don't write a single word until you are sure you have the core of that character understood and held sacrosanct. It's got to be respected, and it's got to be held and maintained. Publishers used to have this thing called the Character Bible, which would help you do that if you're a creator rolling onto a title. The Character Bible would have all the details of what is specific and unique about that character. What is that core? And it's written down. If there is no Character Bible, then do the research and make your own. Prevention only requires one thing. It's the willingness to do the work. And let's talk about the cure. Now, the cure is not always possible, and it's never 100% perfect or complete, but there are some ideas that have already been floated about the character examples that I've mentioned previously, and let's talk about a few of them. Again, it's case by case. Maybe somebody can come up with a better idea. I'm not the super genius of the world, so if you've got a better idea, please let me know in the comments. But there are things that you can do to repair that broken bridge between what the character used to be that made everybody fall in love with him or her and where they are now. Let's start with the big one, because that's the most important one, Spider-Man. The most clear, direct way to kind of get Spider-Man back on track is to retcon one more day. If Marvel does that, at least it gets rid of that curse and undoes everything they have undone. But, I understand that they have this stance that Peter and MJ can't be together again. They have to keep them apart. I think that's stupid. There's no real clear rationale for doing that. But if they insist on doing that, at least retcon one more day through some, magic hooey-dooey. And if you have to keep them apart, get them divorced. Evolve Peter's life. Don't invalidate it. Now, you could say divorce is part of his natural evolution, and that would make more sense. But don't just throw it out and pretend that his life never happened. That's the big mistake that needs to be corrected. Let's move on to John Kent. Okay, this one's tricky, but it's doable, especially because of where he is currently in the modern context. If there's a sales reason to keep John the way he is as an adult and kind of weirdly socially focused and all the other things that are going along with him, then publish the story of his life during those 7 years and try to work in some rationale for how he became who he is. When he was a prisoner of Ultraman, give us those, I think it's about 7 years. Give us those 7 years. Give us a hidden year story where we show him growing up and figuring out what are the challenges, what are the traumas he endured that brought him to his current state. At least that softens the blow, at least that gives him some context. If they can't do that for whatever reason, then create a story where the current John Kent as an adult is not the real John Kent and get rid of him. Let's move on to Harley. Tough. Harley's tough. She is probably one of those examples where she's just so damaged and so far away from who she used to be that the only option is to reset her mind and her body to some kind of alternate universe version of the character. If you have an idea, tell me in the comments below. I want to hear about it, because a reset is the only thing I can possibly think of, and even then, I'm not sure if that's possible. Last but not least, we have Iceman. Probably the easiest thing to do, because in Marvel, there is a reset and repair option. I mean, we can find some way to take advantage of the Krakoan resurrection protocols. Krakoa is gone, but there's always something you can do to kind of bring that back. Just kill him and bring him back to a state before Jean Grey did whatever she did to his brain. That's the situation we have with the current Beast and the current X-Men run with Jed McKay. It's Beast's body, but his mind is before Krakoa. So for all intents and purposes, he is a reset in the truest sense, almost. So barring full mind and body reset, if they can't do that, if they can't use the resurrection protocols, then you could always find another Bobby from the multiverse somewhere, and maybe that's good enough. So which is better, modern or classic? The answer is neither and both. The problem isn't that one is better than the other. The problem is you're asking the wrong question. The question is, why aren't we naturally growing and evolving and transitioning from the classic to the modern? That's how it should go. And there are circumstances where that has occurred. But in modern era times, especially with Marvel and DC, they've broken that bridge that evolves the character from the classic to the modern. It's almost like they want to sever it and keep the audiences in separate camps. But that's not the goal. The goal is to expand the audience, not to replace one with the other, because the modern audience just isn't big enough. Going forward, we have to be open and admit that there's room for everybody. If you like the classic version, great, fine, do that. Or if you like the modern takes, that's okay too. There's nothing wrong with that. We shouldn't be asking which one is better. We should be examining how and where the bridge that transitions readers from the classic to the modern broke, and what are we going to do to fix it. When the bridge is healthy, publishers don't have to replace one with the other. They grow together. But you know what? I want to know what you think. Leave a comment down below with which character you think got that right. Which character is still true to who they were in yesteryear, if we're going to use the old language, but still relevant today. Who is your favorite? And tell me why they sort of successfully traveled that road. Leave a comment down below. And if you're interested in reading the written version of this commentary, there's a link to the newsletter down in the description. So thank you very much for joining, and stay tuned through the outro for more comic commentary and reviews just like this one.